Okay, it looks like the recording is going. And my screen is shared again. Okay. So there's not too many announcements. Um, they said in the actual course announcement that was sent out, I think yesterday, exam one has been finished grading. The grades were kind of all over the place. We had, fair amount of students with A's, a lot of students in the middle, and then, a chunk of students that didn't do as well as they may have wanted to do. And I also had the opportunity and looked at the course tells me how long each student has been logged in. I don't study these, but I was curious because of the variation in grades, and it did look like there was also a large variation in students' time on Cogbooks. So I just want to reiterate from the announcement again. This is it's an online course. It's very fast, so there is going to be a required time component in studying to be successful in the course. And that was our first exam, which, to be fair, generally, in classes are on, kind of on the lower on the average because we're not used to what the exam is going to entail. But now you've seen an exam, you've had a chance to study for one and see what your results are. We have 4 more exams, that can bring a great grades up if need be, or keep them the same if we're doing well. And also just want to point out, remember Cogbooks, just completing the activities in general, just clicking through them will simply get you 100% score, and that's worth 220 points or 2.2 exams worth an A. So that will continue to, as you get through those, it will continue to raise your grade as well through the semester. We had, and speaking of going fast, this course, we have our second exam coming up on Friday already. So we have an exam almost once a week. So with this kind of course, we need to stay on top of stuff. So I still need to add the 4 points for those 2 questions, and I will do that this week yet. So you can also say that your exam score will have 4 more points added onto it. And that doesn't matter if you got the 2 questions that I'm dropping, if you got them correct, you still get the 4 points. If you got them wrong, you'll get the 4 points back, essentially. So everybody gets 4 additional points coming. Yeah, and that's about it. So we can go ahead and we can actually, let me, the wrong document open over here.
That's crazy. I thought the exam was today.
No, not today. Make sure to, and it doesn't help because of the way the class is set up, like on the calendar. The exams are not always on the same day, so they're not always a Wednesday. I try to give at least 6 days, but some exams have 7 in between, some exams have 6. So it's the exam days. Make sure to pay attention to the calendar because they are different. And that's just to give equal time in between the exams based on the length of the course, since it's only about 6.5 weeks. So, and I'll generally try to make an announcement the night before to remind everybody that the exam is the following day. So make sure to keep paying attention to the announcements.
Will do. I thought they were on Wednesdays, and so that's cool. Thank you.
Yeah, better that you thought it was today than you thought it was on Monday next week. So, all right. So let's get into the second half of these modules. So T7 and T6, and we'll start with T7. So a couple of things to point out here is this one is big on evolution, and it starts off talking about the different mechanisms of evolution. So this first one, we have the first mechanism that it talks about is natural selection. So what are we talking about when we say natural selection? Like what is happening?
Moves the average frequency of alleles in one direction or another direction or in both directions, whether it's stabilizing, directional, or disruptive.
Yeah, so there's some outside force that's acting on a population, and it's generally it wants to select for traits that are increased fitness, and it will select against traits that decrease fitness. And that, as you mentioned, it can push the average allele, stabilize it, disrupt it, or it can push, or it can kind of push it to one side or the other. And that's what all these different examples were. So if we look at the first one here, we have stabilizing selection. That essentially means that you have a frequency of some type of phenotype. The x-axis is not real important for this right now, which is why there's no units associated with it. You just have this orange line is the original for the parents, and then for the progeny, you have the blue line. So basically, it just condenses it and it stabilizes it to an intermediate phenotype. So if we look at something like adult body mass, like that was the example that they had here, we noticed that it's being stabilized in the center. There's very few that are low in body mass and very few that are high in body mass. Actually, that's not what it's talking. Oh yeah, there's this adult body mass on the bottom. Never mind. Yeah, so there's a frequency on the y-axis and then adult body mass on the x-axis. So it's the idea here is it's just what's in the it's a intermediate value. That's gonna be a little annoying. Okay, and then it gets into directional selection, and that's a little bit different. Where now it's going to focus on one of the extreme phenotypes. So either on the left side of the curve or the right side of the curve. So it's going to push from the parents to the progeny. A selection force is going to select for something like beak depth. In this generation, the average was 8.8, and it looks pretty evenly distributed. There's not many with 7.3 low or 11.3 high. But what happened is it got pushed for larger beaks. So it was selected for on this side of the beak depth, and you can see the new average is 9.8. So there's more with 10.8, 10.3. These bars increase, so it just pushed it in one direction. And here for a deeper beak depth, it could do the opposite where it pushes it for a shallower beak depth, and then we would have seen the bars go in this direction to the left. All right. And then the last one is disruptive selection. So that's kind of the opposite. Now it favors both phenotypes on the extreme. So if you have kind of a uniform curve, it's going to push the middle down. So the intermediate value is going to be selected against, and both extremes are going to be selected for. Those are the phenotypes that are actually going to increase fitness. So here, what it looks like with some live data, it's not as pretty as the theoretical curves. Most times live data is not. You have the diet type here, right? So you have an omnivore, an intermediate, or a carnivore. And what we see is the intermediate trait was selected against, and that has the lowest portion of each tadpole phenotype compared to the omnivores or the carnivores. Does that make sense? Or any questions about the different types of selection? So I thought these are pretty good. They had pretty good figures explaining them. And then they show this example here. So they call it natural selection in action. What it is it's body size of the parent. So the first generation, you have two large organisms, so two large phenotypes. Their selection pressure is predation. So fish prefer larger prey. So the next generation, they give birth to three large and one small, but half of them get eaten. Two of them are the large. So then they have large and small that reproduce, and they produce more small, and there's still selection pressure on the large, removing that from the population. So eventually this population is going to be pushed towards smaller sizes because that's what's surviving the selection pressure of predation. And this example is pretty cool too, because this actually changed. There's two color phases for this moth. There was a dark color phase, which you can see right here, and this light color phase right here, you can barely see because it's very good camouflage on the side of a tree. Before the industrial period, before the forest got polluted a little bit, the black moths were selected against. Mainly, the thought is they were easier seen by predators, so they got picked off more. And this is this kind of a population in the forest, a pie chart. Only about a quarter are dark and a little over 3/4 are light. And it makes sense. If you can see your prey, you're going to eat more of them. But then when these trees got covered in, I think, soot, what it was, The dark moths actually blended in better, and the light moths blended in not as well. And it was reversed. They were picking off and eating, the predators were eating the light colored moths, which drove the selection in the opposite direction for the population to be more of the dark colored moths. So I thought that was pretty cool examples of directional selection. All right. And then they get into genetic drift. Does anybody want to take a stab at describing kind of what genetic drift is? And you can talk about this deer example a little bit.
Yeah, so genetic drift is the idea that like these recessive genes are going to, or not even yeah, these mutations are going to increase in the population because of like a specific um thing. For example, in this deer example, they closed off the area, so then the deers weren't getting as like they weren't getting eaten by predators, but they also weren't being hunted. So then this mutation gene decided spread through it increased through the population because of the lack of predation. So like that deer would have definitely gotten eaten if there wouldn't have been some type of fence or some type of regulation around hunting. And so yeah, that's what I got.
Yeah, so that's a good way to explain this. And what this example did is it kind of mixed two examples. It mixed mutation with genetic drift. So a key factor for genetic drift is it's due to random chance. So the random chance is the human interference here, right? So the mutation occurred where you get this white colored or white faced deer, which is generally uncommon because natural selection would select against it because again, predators would be able to see them very easily, so they get killed very easily, or even hunters. Humans could be predators too in that sense. It's easier to see this deer in a forest than it is easier to see this deer. So the odds of them getting killed are low. Natural selection would select against that mutation. But on the genetic drift side, when they removed that selection pressure, that was kind of the random chance event that allowed this mutation to sustain in the environment and persist and increase in number. So another example that a lot of times people think of is storms. So say we have two islands out in the ocean and they have bird populations that are kind of distinct, but they're the same species. And there's a storm that hits, but it only really hits one island. And these birds have uh, a range of beak size ranging from large to small. If the storm hits one island and kills about 95% of that island, and a small subpopulation survives, and by chance, they all have large beaks. When that subpopulation starts to recover, that island is going to drift towards large beaks because of that random event of a storm indirectly, selected randomly those large beaks, and then that's just what's there to recover. Now, migration from the other island could offset that and reintroduce smaller beak size. But if it doesn't have that migration, then it would be, people might ask, why are beaks bigger out there? Well, because the population had that random storm, a random event, and that's what survived, and that's how the genes drifted. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, especially the storm example that's providing a differential in survival that's not based on any exact phenotypic characteristic, but more just like random chance. But I wanted to ask
Mm-hmm.
about the deer example because it says that right after a couple white deer appeared due to mutation, that all of a sudden they were they were artificially selected because the normal deer got shot, but the base didn't allow them to shoot the white deer. So to me, I was really racking my brain to see how this is a solid example of drift and not just an example of artificial selection on a population that has a mutation because they were really driving white deer by not hunting them and hunting everything else. And it was,
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think this is the best example, which is why I wanted to bring up the storm one. I think that's more clear cut because this mixes mutation
right.
and natural selection with genetic drift, which maybe the point was to show that all of these forces can be acting simultaneously, just like the heat flux that we talked about previously. So I think what the random chance is that humans decided to interfere and protect the white deer and kill the regular colored brown deer. even though that could be argued that that was a form of artificial or natural selection, depending on if humans want to say we're cognitive or not cognitive of driving selection pressures. So I think to describe it as genetic drift, it would have to be that humans are the random chance event affecting that population and allowing the white population to survive. It would have been made more sense if they would have said humans came in and wiped out the brown color population and only left, a large, a small portion that was predominantly white, and then the population recovered and was
Yeah,
very much white. Like, to me, that would have
yeah,
made maybe a little more
that makes
sense,
way more
but
sense. Yeah, like if they wiped out everyone except for like two deers, and those two deer had a mutation, and then the whole population swung just based on those two, kind of a bottleneck or founder effect rather than anyway. Yeah.
yeah, no, I think that's a great point to bring up. Good discussion. And yeah, I think, yeah, they could have done better with this example for sure. To start, maybe to end with that would have been better because, let's talk about them collectively and not just, you know, all at once before we even introduce them really, because then the title is genetic drift, but then it has mutation, and then genetic drift isn't even really brought up specifically until down here. So Cogbooks is far from perfect, but I think we work with it together, we can get through it. And then this genetic drift example is kind of how some populations, when they're out in the open, had their eyes and more melanin, and some populations that were in the cave lost their eyes and lost their melanization. And they asked, some scientists said, well, is this just disruptive selection? But uh, when they took them out of their environments and put them in hybrid populations, they found that it did drift into one direction over the other without any selective pressures. So they were able to rule out natural selection, and rather it was actual drift for these fish, the ones in the cave and the ones out in the open. The smaller eyes for the ones in the open were actually better. So it drifted away from having large eyes. And then this one talks about how migration reduces genetic variation between populations. Why would we describe it that it reduces genetic variation? Why would migration not increase genetic variation? Because when we say migration, it's the movement of individuals from one population to the other. So if we have two populations mixing, why isn't that increasing genetic variation?
Is it because of natural selection? So like even if they're two different from two different populations, natural selection will then favor whatever genes increase fitness in that particular area. So then it ultimately leads to a decrease in genetic variation.
Not quite, but I think you're on a little bit of track with the genetic variation.
There's that, and also something about like you're constantly introducing a stream of alleles from another population, and those alleles coming in are going to represent some kind of average distribution of the second population. So they're always arriving and exchanging. You're gonna influence the mean between those two populations and kind of bring the average distribution of alleles into, a little bit more of a synchronization because in a sense the two populations are communicating information between each other or something like that.
Yes, I think you're both on track that it definitely does involve natural selection, but what types of natural selection have we talked about so far? If it
Genetic.
brings the average kind of together, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say genetic drift is what we talked about, but
Stabilizing selection.
oh, that's right.
Yeah,
And yeah,
yeah, and then the other one is disruptive selection, right? So if they're coming from two different areas and they're continuously mixing, that's probably going to do, if it's going to be natural selection, be stabilizing selection. It's going to kind of homogenize those two environments genetically. If they're isolated and they don't mix, they might start drifting from one another, and you might get some type of, it look more like disruptive selection. So it kind of prevents any drift from one another and prevents any extremes by continuously mixing and homogenizing.
That makes sense, especially when associated with disruptive and stabilizing. Interesting.
Okay. And then this gets into some activities. And I didn't catch it, so I was kind of curious with the class. I don't think they introduced negative or positive, the words with directional selection in the text. Or did I miss it somewhere?
No, I didn't catch it either. I just, because I've taken statistics, I knew that negative goes down and positive goes
Sure.
up.
I think maybe this is some of they assume you know how to read a positive or negative graph, but I just want to make sure I didn't miss it myself. But okay. Yeah, so they don't use the word negative or positive until the activity. But what we have on these figures is we have a phenotypic value on the x-axis, and it's usually just going to go from like low to high, we can say, or in one direction. And then the fitness is on the y-axis, and that goes from 0, no fitness, to 1 being the highest possible fitness. And do we generally want high or low fitness?
High.
Yeah, so we're going to want a phenotypic value that's going to represent high fitness, but we can look at the trend. If we read them all from left to right, like how we read a figure, this one is moving from high relative fitness to low relative fitness. What would we say this one is?
Negative.
Yeah, so first we would say it's directional, right? Because it's moving from high to one direction to the other, and then we can say it's going from high to low, so that's moving in a negative direction. The slope would be negative if we drew a line on there. And this one, it's the opposite, right? When we move from left to right, we go from low to high. So we'd probably say that's positive directional. And then this one is the highest fitness, kind of it's in the middle, right? So it's pushing it more towards the middle. So this we would say is what, stabilizing selection, right? Because it's making kind of that intermediate, it's a selecting for that intermediate phenotypic value in the middle. And then this one, it's more, look, the highest fitness are in the extremes. So this would select for one of the two extremes or both of the extremes, really. And this would be disruptive selection.
Wait, can you, before you move on, you said that the bottom left hand, the stabilizing, you said it's because it's more in the middle of the phenotypic value. So I guess my mind is reading the relative fitness and seeing that like because the relative fitness is dropping with the overall population, I was thinking it was disruptive, but I guess I was reading it very wrong. So we could just
Yeah, because
yeah.
yeah, so we want to, for these, we can look at where the highest value of relative fitness is, and that's in the middle. So it would probably want to push, it would select for moving towards an intermediate phenotypic value. The low ones have lower relative fitness, and the high ones have even lower. So we don't want the outside values. We would want to be pushed in the intermediate values. And I
Hmm.
think
Okay.
these are a little bit easier to understand because they put numbers on the x-axis.
Okay. I'll wait for you to do this one.
Okay, so what type of selection do we have right here?
Negative directional.
Yeah, so we have negative directional, and then it asks us to, what is it? What's the optimal phenotype? So, and by phenotype, we want to say what's the optimal value? What would we say the optimal value is for A and why?
Would it be closer to 0 because the population has the highest fitness?
Exactly. So when we want to find the optimal phenotypic value, we find the highest level of relative fitness associated with that. So at 0, they tend to be on the high end. In the intermediate, they're kind of in the middle, and at the high end, they're on the low end. So yeah, this one would be 0. And where are we finding the highest relative fitness in B associated
Like
with the x-axis?
19 and above.
Yeah, right. So 19 and above, over to the right. And then what about C?
22.
Yeah, so we say somewhere in the middle, it's around 20, maybe a little to the right, not greater than 50, right? It's not 0 and it's not great. Well, that one's possible, but 22 is the better answer here. Um, And then this last one, by process of elimination, we know it's greater than 50, but why isn't it 0?
Isn't it also 0? Less
This
than 0?
for
You,
the
you can say
optimal
that.
phenotype. If the highest values are on the right. So out of
Yeah,
these data points, like these are higher than this one. So these would be good, but not the optimal. Optimal means best, right? So the highest. So
fair enough.
just if these were the points right here, I think we could say they would be pretty even, but because these 2 points over here, and again with these, you can think of it as an, kind of best answer, most likely answer. So I think that's why it's going with, because it has these points over here. Do these two types of activities make sense?
Yeah, it makes more sense now.
Okay, because these will be, you'll probably see these again on the exam. So, were there any other questions from anything in T7?
No, I'm good.
Okay. And if anybody does have questions that's not on here or haven't gotten to it yet, or they come up later, I'm always available through messaging. But right
Are we gonna
now,
have,
go ahead.
uh, pardon me, are we gonna have a figure legend or a graphic that has, like, if we're gonna determine if this is selection or drift, like, is it random or not? And the reason I ask is sometimes it's hard to interpret the regression line of a bunch of points and can kind of get confusing. And I was wondering if if there's going to be some judgment call on that, or if it's going to be a little more clear when on exam time.
The figures or the images are going to be coming from cogbooks that are on the exam. So be
Sweet,
familiar with
sweet. Okay.
those. And if it's really close and you make an argument as to why, I'll hear it out and don't have a problem giving partial or full credit back, like after the exam. Try to pick clear images from cogbooks to make it less confusing. Bring up a fair point that that one was, the 2 points made the difference. But
Fair enough. Thank you.
okay, so now if we move into T8, we get into life history. And as this was pointed out, this title is wrong. It should just be a repeat of this title. Some words got left out, so it should be a life history stems from how an organism uses energy. So I think there's even why that blank space is there, but that's a Cogbooks issue. I can't actually change this. I can write them an email, so I appreciate that that was pointed out previously. But when we talk about life histories, what are we talking about? What makes up an organism's life history? How would we describe it?
It's kind of like the pacing of the various stages of life for different organism, kind of going around the circle, like the time to size and hatching at birth, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The pacing or the schedule of an organism's life that includes the different stages through development and reproduction, and yeah, so I think it's a good way to look at it. And this is a good example because it just shows for a butterfly, right? It starts off as an egg or an embryo, and it grows and develops into caterpillar, cocoon, and then emerges as an adult. And it talks about parental investment and offspring. So just kind of everything that has to do essentially with its life, development, and reproduction. And then it talks about slow to fast life history continuums. So what does it mean by slow and fast life history continuums?
What I understood was that some organisms, like on the slow end of the spectrum, have a long time to reach sexual maturity. So they have longer lifespans, and then they have really high parental investment. And then on the fast end of the spectrum, it's like, boom, like short times of sexual maturity. So it's like they mature sexually really quickly. They have high numbers of offspring. They're going to have a ton of babies in that short amount of time. And then they have very little parental investment because they have so many um, offspring coming. And I also think that they have shorter lifespans.
Yeah, so the two main ones to start with are usually they're larger organisms with longer lifespans and they're versus smaller organisms with short lifespans. So we can think of large organisms like elephants, albatross, the giant tortoises. They live long, so it takes them longer to develop, which can take them longer to reach sexual maturity. They tend to, and like you mentioned, they tend to have low numbers of offspring and then invest high levels of parental care. And the fast end of the spectrum is the opposite. We think of things like fruit flies that live very short lives. They're very small organisms. They reproduce, almost immediately within probably 24 hours of emerging as an adult. They become reproductive. They can mate and have lots of offspring. Because they have that lots of offspring, the trade-off is then, yeah, again, they have very little parental care. So very good. And then it gets into actual, more specific examples of this. So it talks about plants, and then it has this example here where it has the goldenrod, the woolly lousewort, and the Canada thistle. And there are three different types of plants. One is a ruderal, one is a stress tolerator, and one is a competitor. So they live in, and the difference is, and it will be a little bit important to understand the difference in these three plants. So how would we describe a stress tolerator? What kind of environment does it grow in?
Maybe really cold or like salty or some way really difficult.
Yeah, so an extreme environment, we would maybe say. And that could be temperature, salinity, pH. So it lives kind of on the extremes. It can survive where other plants can't make it. What about competitors? Kind of in the name, right? They're really good competitors. They can outcompete other plants. And then what is a ruderal? What does that mean?
I understood it. I know that they had said it in the book, but they said that they were like weeds. And so they kind of are constantly like out surviving or can survive kind of in any condition and then also like keep reproducing. That's what yeah.
Yeah, you're on the right track, but there's a specific way they describe them. What kind of what about their environment?
They colonized recently disturbed Earth, I think.
Yeah, so they can colonize very readily in areas that have been recently disturbed or that have regular disturbances. Yeah, so that's kind of how these differentiate. And then there's a table here that talks about three different types of plants. It talks about their growth rate, how it differs, the age of sexual maturity, the proportion of energy used to make seeds, and the importance of vegetation and reproduction. So it just shows kind of how they differ, and it's related to that fast, slow spectrum.
And then for the was it ruderals? Yeah. So then if it's like, is it like an example would be like a hiking trail where it's like it's constantly being disturbed, but they're like being able to survive within, or like something that just
Mhm.
like burned down and then they're more quickly than the other two to come back. Is
I
that
think it's both. Yeah, so if it's a place that's been disturbed, they're probably the early succession species. And if it's
okay?
a place that's regularly disturbed, they can tolerate that disturbance. So a hiking trail, I think, is a good example. And another example, something that's freshly disturbed might be a sidewalk that's put in and the plants that grow in the cracks, right?
Oh,
That's a very disturbed area. Those are the types of plants that are going to be able to grow there. Or something that gets mowed very frequently. So I think these are, yeah, it's a type of thistle, right? These are really hard to get out of your lawn. You can mow them repeatedly, but they just keep growing back unless you dig them out by the root or you chemically kill them.
okay, cool.
And there was something about rudderals having tending to have seeds that can stay in the soil for a long, long, long time, just waiting for the right chance uh to sprout or something like that.
So yeah, maybe waiting for that disturbance. So if a fire occurs, they might be activated after the fire or because of the fire. That's a really good point too. All right, so then this gets into trade-offs and talks about the principle of allocation. How would we describe this principle? What is it getting at?
Um, I understood that our or organism's life can only put energy into specific things, and so it's gonna choose to put in the energy. So for like, for example, there was an example of like some organisms when they reach when some female organisms when they reach sexual maturity, they will no longer continue to grow because their body's like, you know what, I can't do that anymore. We're actually gonna just focus on trying to reproduce. And so like that principle about is like, how do I allocate my resources for the maximum fitness?
Exactly. So that's an allocation of an internal resource of energy. When they're young, they're going to allocate a lot of the energy that they bring in through food towards growth and development. But when they, like you said, when they reach their adult size and they stop growing, they can reallocate that resource to something such as reproduction or mating that they weren't doing while they were growing, because they have a finite amount of energy that they can allocate to different aspects of their life history, and that allocation can shift at different times of their life history. It's like if we go back to the very beginning, that butterfly, when it goes into a cocoon, it's going to allocate tons of energy towards the metamorphosis, right? It's not going to allocate energy towards finding a mate or reproduction at that point, but it's going to allocate almost all of its energy to, maintenance and metamorphosis and that development. So, and it talked about there are kind of three things to think about with allocation. So there's physical constraints or trade-offs. So the example they gave was the size of a uterus in a female. That's going to limit the size of its offspring as well as the number of offspring. So if a female has a large uterus, it can have larger offspring or it could have more offspring. If a female had a smaller uterus, it's going to have smaller offspring or fewer offspring. And then it
Well,
talked about,
what were the three
sorry, go
things
ahead.
again, Dr. Rush? What were the three things again? The
So
three.
the first one was just physical constraints, and I haven't gotten to the other ones yet. The next one is allocation of resources, which we kind of talked about with energy being a good example of that. And the third thing is the genetic constraints. And that
Cool.
talks about, since some genes have multiple effects, selection is going to favor genes of one life history trait. It can cause other life history traits to change too, because genes are not necessarily isolated. They have downstream effects or they affect multiple phenotypes. And the big picture in the end with principle of allocation is it's all going to work towards maximizing an organism's fitness. All right. And then these next couple sections are pretty good. They break it down into individual costs and effects. So the first one is just the cost of reproduction, right? So what this study is actually pretty cool. It's a two-part study. So what they have is they have in the top figure, we have the number of kestrels fledged. So this is focused on the offspring. And on the x-axis, it shows what the treatments were. So they either removed two chicks, they left the nest alone, or they added two chicks to the nest. And we just look at number of eggs fledged. When they left it alone, that's just kind of what the average was, around 5. When they removed two chicks, it went to 3. They lost chicks, so of course they fledged less. When they added the chicks, it kind of was the variance was really high. It generally tended to increase the number of chicks fledged, but in some nests they did worse, the same, and some nests they did better. So it really depended on the adult's ability to rear those offspring, on if it improved their fledgling output or not. And then the second part was they looked at the adults of those nests and looked at their survival. And what they found is when they removed two chicks, those adults survived greater, both the males and the females. And the idea was that required less energy to rear fewer chicks, so it was less stressful for the adults, and they had a higher chance of surviving. And then we saw the opposite. When they added two chicks, the adults tried to compensate and rear all of those chicks, and it was really stressful on them to find food and continuously hunt. And they actually had a lower survival. So reproduction can be costly, and there's going to be an optimal a number of offspring because there's a limited amount of energy that the offspring can produce. Okay. And then the next one talks about growth and reproduction. So this figure here is kind of showing the expected survival of an organism, or the expected survival past sexual maturity versus the female age of sexual maturity. And it all shows a general trend. If they wait longer for sexual maturity, they will be expected to live a little bit longer past that sexual maturity. But then we see a difference in the steepness in the curves, and that's the difference between more short-lived organisms and longer-lived organisms. Whereas longer-lived organisms tend to develop a little bit later in life.
Are there certain reasons why these certain groups were selected independently of each other, or is it just showing that in all cases there's a general correlation between age at sexual maturity and survival?
I think like it says, it's just a comparison across species.
Okay.
That it's a general trend that we see across all, even though there's some variation across the groups. And across the groups is, I think what it said is that they're to the right, like I think these are longer lived organisms. It doesn't say it in the figure caption, maybe it said it in the text I thought somewhere, but
No big. It doesn't sound like that's particularly super important to understand that difference between the two clades or
yeah. And I think, yeah, here it just shows that birds and mammals have the shortest times to sexual maturity, so they go to sexual maturity quicker, compared to reptiles, fish, and shrimp have the longest time to sexual maturity. So I think it was just showing the general trend's the same, but across these clades, it's different. And it did not get into much detail as to why, and that's not important for the exam, at least. Obviously, it's important on some level. But fair question. And then this gets into another kind of a specific example with experiments. And this one talks about the number of offspring. So you can generally have, many small or few large. There's going to be trade-offs on how you want to divvy up your energy. And it kind of showed the example here that as we have the total number of seeds produced by this goldenrod plant decreases as the size or mass of the seed increases. So if they're putting more energy into individual seeds, they're going to have less. If they put less energy into seeds, they can have more because there's a finite amount of energy that parent plant has. And then we kind of talked about this one a little bit. So this is just a trade-off with the number of offspring and parental care. And generally the trend is more offspring you have, the worse parental care you're able to provide because your time and energy, again, is limited. You can't, if you have 10 offspring, you have to divide that equally. If you have 5, they get twice as much. And this is a kind of a cool example here where they looked at the number of eggs in a nest versus the number of magpie chicks fledged. And as we go from left to right, there's an initial positive. You go from 5 to 6 to 7. The more eggs, the more offspring. But then when you get to 8, we would think on one level, maybe they got more offspring, they're going to fledge more, but the parents aren't able to provide that high level parental care to 8, so that all of them actually suffer, and the amount that fledge drops back down to a little over 2, even though there's 8 offspring. So very few actually fledge when there's that many offspring in the nest. The parents just can't keep up, can't keep them healthy. And then this gets into abiotic conditions of the environment. And the one they really focus on is photoperiod, because it has a really strong effect across many different organisms. They can recognize changes in photoperiod. So day lengths getting longer, day lengths getting shorter. And that often tends to initiate chemical reactions in the organisms or physiological responses. Like it can cue things like onset of reproduction, the beginning of mating season, and as well as the ending of mating season, and maybe even in others when migration should start. So there's other factors that they interact with a little bit, like sometimes there's temperature, humidity effects, barometric pressure, but photoperiod seems to be, on a general sense, the strongest abiotic factor affecting an organism's kind of life history, so, or at least some aspects of it. All right. And then resources affecting life history. I think this one's pretty straightforward. They talk about, they have an experiment here where they have some frogs were given food, high levels of food, and some were given low levels of food. And what they saw was the ones that had high level of food, entered metamorphosis when they were younger compared to those that entered that were given lower levels of food. So, and they talk about there's two possible scenarios, or really three, that this could happen. Is they predicted A, they can either produce at the same age or metamorphosize at the same age, but the trade-off would be they'd be much lighter. Their mass would be much lower, so they'd be probably smaller. And smaller is not great for reproduction as an adult because in certain species, size matters for competition, size matters in attracting mates. Also, size can matter in avoiding predators as well. So smaller sizes, you have some costs associated with it. The other trade-off would be to reach the same size, but take a lot longer. So they'd be older before they reach this metamorphosis stage. And the trade-off of that is they're in a more juvenile, more vulnerable stage for a longer period of time. So they're more vulnerable to predators. And they're also missing out on a large chunk of their life that they're not able to then reproduce after this metamorphosis. But what they actually found is there's kind of an intermediate value. So they waited a little bit longer and were a little bit smaller. So it wasn't an all or nothing. It was this intermediate value is what they actually did in nature. All right. And then this talks about how predators can have an effect. What was the effect of the predators?
It's like shorter life histories overall, it seemed like.
Well,
Quicker life.
shorter specific aspects of life history, right? So their development time was actually accelerated. Why would it make sense for these? I think these are frogs or salamander eggs, an amphibian egg or fish egg, whatever. It's not important. Why would it make sense for these eggs to develop faster and hatch quicker if their predator's a snake?
So they don't get eaten.
Exactly, right? They're in an immobile stage, so they're extremely vulnerable. If they hatch, they're still vulnerable to the predator, but at least they can move and hide, and they're not just sitting in an egg mass waiting to be eaten by the snake. Exactly. So predators can have, impacts on their prey and actually speed up their development. And what we see here, there's a pretty cool study with no predator, and the crayfish is the predator. So what they saw is when they exposed them to a predator, their age at their first reproduction was actually greater. So they waited longer to reproduce. The mass at first reproduction was larger. So part of that was they waited longer because I think they were bigger, and it made them less vulnerable to the predator. Because then when they looked at lifetime egg production, there was actually no difference. So it's interesting that they showed these changes, but it actually didn't really, at least in egg production, have a strong effect on this part of their fitness. Now, they don't talk about it didn't affect maybe their overall survival, which is also part of fitness, the viability of their eggs, which is part of fitness. So there's a few pieces that the study didn't get at, but it shows how predators can actually have an impact on some aspects of life history. All right. In this video, we're not going to watch it here, obviously. So hope you have watched it or will watch it, but it does a good job discussing some optimal allocation during reproduction and actually kind of sets us up for these activities, which are the different calculations. So without watching that video, there's not much text that sets us up for these, but I do want to walk through these and kind of show how I would go about solving them. So what we have is on the x-axis is we have energy invested per offspring measured in kilojoules going from 0 to 250, and then survivorship, so that this generally goes from 0 to 1. And the first question is, what is the minimal amount of energy that a female can invest in an offspring? And all that means is we're looking at where this line intersects the x-axis, and it does that at 30. So that's just the minimum amount of energy for an offspring. And it's generally going to be more than, like, it's going to be 30 point something or 31 to be above 0.
I hope this isn't splitting hairs, but if it's 30 kilojoules, that gets you a survivorship of 0. So I was kind of wondering what what an
I agree.
Okay, thank you.
No, I agree. And that's what I say. I think it would be like 30.1 or something, like it'd have to be just above 30.
Cool.
Unless that line, if we zoom in, it would have to be a hair below 30. So it is kind of splitting hairs, but it's a valid point. Like, it would be the lowest point on the x-axis where you get a slightly positive value on the y-axis. And
Cool.
the answer key gives us 30, so. But I would argue, yeah, it would be like probably 30.1, or that is slightly to the left of 30. So maybe the way I said it, where it intersects it, that's not exactly correct. It's just to the right of where it intersects it, because where it intersects it would be 0. So no, that's a good point. Okay. So then the second question asks, what is the survivorship of an offspring with 100 kilojoules of energy? How would we go about solving this using this figure?
I'd go up from 100 on the x-axis and see where the y is at.
Absolutely. So you can see this Word document, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it's absolutely correct when it says we have 100 kilojoules on so you find 100 on the x-axis and you draw a line straight up to the line where it hits it, then you go to the left, and then where that intersects that y-axis, just as said, about 0.5, and that's the answer we get from Cogwebs 2. And then number 3 says, what is the question? So that says the optimal investment of energy maximizes the product of the number of offspring and the survivorship of each offspring. So that would be if this would be number of offspring, say you had 10 offspring, you could intersect it too. You would multiply it by the survivorship. So it's the product of that. So I think they have an image of that in one of the coming activities. But you have to multiply the number of offspring with the survivorship of each offspring. Let's see if it's this one. Oh, this is still energy. So this one's a little bit different. So this says, assuming that a female has 1,000 kilojoules of energy available for reproduction, how many offspring? So it's kind of like the inverse of what that previous question was. So it's still related. But yeah, so we have 1,000 kilojoules of energy for that female available for reproduction. How many offspring would make the optimal clutch size? Or how many offspring of the optimal size should she produce? So what clutch size essentially are we looking for here? What the number of offspring?
Yeah, now I don't know why this works, but according to the video, if you put the line starting at the graph origin all the way resting on the curve, where it rests on the curve is the optimum. But I'm not sure why that works, but it seemed like that's what the video was communicating.
Yeah, so what you want to do is find the tangent line, the inflection point right here, and then draw down to the x-axis, and that'll give us 100 is the optimal number because it gives us the highest survivorship. Because what we want to do is this curve is increasing, and then it essentially plateaus at this point, and then the slope is decreasing. Like it's investing too much energy that it's no longer, and eventually it'll completely plateau and drop, but it just doesn't show that on this figure. So this is where the rate of survivorship is going to be the highest because the growth rate of the curve is the highest. So then we find the x-axis value and we take what we have available, 1,000, and we divide it by that x-axis value, so 100, and 10 would be the optimal number to have the highest survivorship with that amount of energy input. I mean, yes, technically they could make more, but the energy input available would not produce the best quality offspring, and they wouldn't have the overall best quality or the best survivorship. Does that make sense then?
That makes pretty good sense. As a from a mathematical question, I wasn't sure why we selected that particular tangent. I mean, starting at the origin and going up, but I think it works,
Yeah.
and I'm cool with
And
that.
okay, and it has to do with the rate it's like accelerating and then decelerating. I know it's still positive, but I think that's maybe a better way to state it, is this is an accelerating rate and then a decelerating rate that eventually will tend towards zero. So you want to find it when it's still accelerating at the maximum rate.
Cool.
And by do that tangent line is what shows us that. So then I think, yeah, this is a very similar question, right? So it's just a different figure, same idea. Assuming that a female has 1,000 kilojoules of energy to invest in her eggs, which of the following clutch sizes would be closest to the optimum again? So we would do the same thing. And for the exam, you will see these exact same type of questions with different numbers. So it's kind of annoying on a computer, I agree, because you kind of have to eyeball it. If you want to, anybody use a ruler, a piece of paper on the computer screen or two, that's fine. You know, I'm okay with that during the exam as well to help estimate. But again, you draw that tangent line, and then at the center of it, you drop it down, and the value here is 200. So we start with 1,000 divided by the optimal energy invested per individual. 1,000 divided by 200 is 5. So this female should have 5 offspring because she has a different survival curve.
I guess what got me, Dr. Rush, and I'll find an example here, but they were saying that we always start the tangent line at the origin of the graph and rest it onto. I agree with what you I think that makes, but there I'll look for it on cog books, but it was starting all of those tangents from 0.0 over 0. And yeah, from that origin
So,
and
so over
resting the
here,
tangent. Yeah, it was doing that for every single one, starting them at the origin and resting them and saying where it rests on that curve is, and that's kind of what got me. Is like, doesn't that have to do with how the graph is arranged? But exactly, that's the example I kept,
so
and I'll look for an
it did
example in
that.
cog.
I I'll go back and look at the video myself too. But if that's the case, I'm not understanding it because I'll have to go back and double check that. I'm glad you brought it up. Um, but this way gets us to that answer. And if
Yeah,
it
I
is
agree.
drastically different, I'll make a course announcement and kind of re-explain this a little bit better.
And
So
I'll look for an example on cog books too, so I'm not just talking air.
sure, no, but I appreciate you bringing it up. That's what these are for, these office hours. So um, yeah, and then this activity 2C is the exact same thing. Again, females 1,000. Draw a tangent line, drop it down. 1,000 divided by 50 is 20. Yeah, so those are, yeah, so that's how we get these answers that Cogbooks is looking for. Um, yeah, and that really, other than, now we have a case, and then I think another series of videos that are important to watch. Are there any questions or anything that we wanted to go over? Any of the activities or content from T8?
I don't know about everyone else, but I'm fairly confident with that, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and for anybody that's not here and watches this, anything that didn't make sense or that I didn't cover, feel free to email me. I will go back and look at that video to double check. And if it's different than how I showed it, I will definitely make a class announcement or course announcement and explain what the difference is. So we both get to the same answer. So I need to refresh and watch that video again. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Now I'm looking for the time code of that video where it did that. But yeah, that's what I was like. You have the it kept starting with the tangent at the origin and then so yeah, but I mean that
And it
sounds
could
good either
be
way, you know.
where the figure was or where the curve was drawn, but because that's going to affect where it intersects the x-axis. So unless it perfectly lined up with zero, but
It,
that'd
it
be
perfectly lined up with 0 every time, and I was getting them wrong until I used my paper to put it in the bottom corner of the graph, and then, but yeah, so enough said on that. I'll double check it too, because now I'm wondering about it.
sure. But yeah, if so, yeah, if there's no more questions, then we'll go ahead and call this a session. And don't forget, we have our exam on Friday. And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to, please message me ahead of time. I thank you all that joined. Have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Rush.
Problem.